And she was like a second mom. She loved being a big sister.
On April 22, 2009, 17-year-old Brittanee Drexel left her home in Chile, New York, chasing independence her mother had begged her not to seek. She told her family she was staying with a local friend for spring break, but instead, she boarded a ride south hundreds of miles away to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. It was a choice fueled by restlessness, the need to break free, the lure of sun, sand, and unsupervised freedom. Her mother, Dawn, had no idea her daughter was slipping beyond her reach. For Brittanee, Myrtle Beach was a stage of neon-lit streets, crowded boardwalks, and teenagers laughing too loudly at all hours. She blended in, another spring breaker with a bright smile, long brown hair, and ambitions bigger than her years. Her friends stayed at the Bar Harbor Hotel, a budget spot with its own share of chaos and noise. Brittanee was supposed to be safe there. She wasn't. Subscribe to this channel for more real-life cold cases that have been solved. Every view, like, and comment keeps these victims' names alive and ensures their stories are not forgotten. Drop your city or country in the comments, and I will create a video on a cold case from your area. Because every community has stories that deserve to be told. And remember this. Brittanee Drexel was just 17 years old when her life was stolen. For years, silence and lies kept her family in the dark. If you don't speak up, if you don't share, if you don't push for awareness, these stories risk being buried again, just like Brittanee was for 13 long years. Don't scroll past, hit subscribe, leave a comment, and make sure these victims are never erased by time. Brittanee Drexel was born on October 7, 1991, in Rochester, New York. From the very beginning, she carried a spark, an energy that made her stand out among her peers. She grew up in the suburb of Chile, just outside Rochester, raised primarily by her mother, Dawn Drexel, who described her daughter as strong-willed, spirited, and independent. Life for Brittanee wasn't without challenges. As a child, she was diagnosed with persistent strabismus, a condition that caused her eyes to misalign. It meant multiple corrective surgeries and years of learning to live with the self-consciousness that came from being different. But if anything, the condition sharpened her determination. Rather than letting it hold her back, Brittanee leaned into her resilience. She learned how to push forward, how to take control of her image, and how to carry herself with confidence. On the night of April 25, 2009, as the humid air settled heavy on the coast, Brittanee decided to leave the Bar Harbor Hotel and walk to the Blue Water Resort, where another friend was staying. It was a short walk, about a mile, across busy streets lined with tourists and spring break crowds. Nothing about the decision seemed unusual. Surveillance footage from the Blue Water Resort clocked her arrival. The time was 8:45 p.m. She moved with confidence, not like someone lost or out of place. She spent a short while there, then left again, heading back toward her own hotel. Those grainy camera images are the last proof the world has of her alive. As she walked, Brittanee pulled out her phone and sent her boyfriend a text. She told him she was heading back. It was simple, casual. "I'm walking back now." Words that carried no sense of alarm, no foreshadowing of disaster. Minutes later, his reply went unanswered. The silence grew louder. Her phone stopped receiving calls, stopped returning texts. For investigators, technology filled in what Brittanee no longer could. Her cell signal began to move, away from Myrtle Beach, away from the safety of hotels and crowds. The data showed a chilling truth. Her phone was traveling south, along US Route 17, slipping into the isolated stretches of Georgetown and Charleston counties. Somewhere on that route, between neon lights and rural darkness, Brittanee vanished. This was not a girl who disappeared by choice. Brittanee was 17, but she was driven. She had ambitions to become a cosmetologist, dreams of modeling, and a love for soccer that kept her disciplined. She was fashionable, strong-willed, and full of restless energy. Behind every decision was a teenager trying to prove she could stand on her own. She was also close to her mother, despite the friction of adolescence. Dawn described her daughter as independent but loving, never the type to run away and cut off contact. That's why the silence was terrifying. Her disappearance shattered every line of normalcy. One moment, she was another teenager on spring break. The next, she was a missing person whose phone whispered the only clue: movement toward the shadows of South Carolina's back roads. The aftermath was immediate, chaotic, and desperate. Myrtle Beach police launched searches across sand dunes, swamps, and neighborhoods. Helicopters circled overhead. Flyers plastered telephone poles. Volunteers combed wooded areas. Still, there was no Brittanee. In the span of hours, her mother's world turned inside out. Dawn had no idea her daughter was in Myrtle Beach until the phone calls stopped coming. She had been tricked by her daughter's cover story, robbed of the chance to protect her. Now, she was left with nothing but panic and questions no one could answer. April 25th was the night Brittanee Drexel disappeared into silence. A silence that stretched beyond days and weeks into years. A silence that only deepened with every failed search, every rumor, every unanswered call. She texted her boyfriend saying she was heading back to her hotel. That simple message, routine, ordinary, almost dismissive in tone, became the last known contact anyone would ever have from Brittanee Drexel. After that, the silence fell hard. Her boyfriend's replies never reached her. Her friends tried calling. Her mother, hours away in New York, grew frantic when Brittanee's phone no longer lit up. Every attempt rang into emptiness. Investigators later uncovered the only clues her phone would leave behind. The signal stopped behaving as if it belonged to a teenager walking back to a hotel. Instead, it began to travel south, leaving behind the bright strip of Myrtle Beach, moving steadily down US Route 17. The route carried her away from the crowded boardwalk, away from the hotels and tourist lights, into the darker, more rural stretches that divide Georgetown and Charleston counties. Each ping traced her deeper into isolation, until even that signal went dead. Those last digital footprints told a story she could no longer tell herself. Brittanee wasn't walking back to her hotel. She was being taken, pulled away from safety, dragged into the unknown. The search for Brittanee shifted from worry to urgency. She was officially treated as missing, and law enforcement expanded their scope across Myrtle Beach, into the Santee region, and even down toward Georgetown. Volunteers, family, and officers moved through neighborhoods, ditches, and marshland, desperation thickening with each hour she remained unfound. But what no one knew at that exact time was that the man responsible for her disappearance was already brushing shoulders with the law. Around that same period, a man, who would years later be named and convicted, was stopped by police in Surfside Beach during a routine traffic check. He was questioned, then allowed to drive away. A chilling what-if moment, forever stamped into the timeline. The summer sun had long since faded, but the name Brittanee Drexel refused to vanish from the streets of Myrtle Beach. Between 2009 and 2012, the fight to find her became a desperate, exhausting pursuit. A hunt defined by volunteer sweat, police strategies, media campaigns, and endless questions that seemed to yield no answers. When Brittanee first went missing, authorities moved quickly. They set up a command center, combed the beaches, and widened their search through marshlands, wooded areas, and backroads of coastal South Carolina. Deputies walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, while divers plunged into dark waterways, searching for the slightest sign of her. Volunteers poured in from across the Carolinas and beyond, Parents carried water bottles and flashlights. Students wore printed t-shirts with her photograph. Entire families walked ditches and wooded paths in the sweltering heat, their voices calling out her name, praying for a response that never came. Canine units were deployed, their handlers tightening leashes as dogs picked up faint trails that led to dead ends, fading into the churn of Myrtle Beach traffic and ocean air. The dogs circled, barked, then lost the scent. Each time hope rose, then fell like a stone in the chest. From the very beginning, media coverage was intense. Local outlets broadcast nightly updates, while national networks began taking notice of the young teenager whose face became synonymous with both innocence and mystery. News anchors repeated her last known movements: leaving the Blue Water Resort, walking alone on a Saturday night, never to be seen again. Her mother, Dawn Drexel, appeared on camera more times than she could count. Sometimes exhausted, sometimes angry, always pleading. She begged for information, for answers, for someone to step forward. The case became personal for viewers. For parents, it was a nightmare made real. A daughter leaving on spring break only to vanish. For teenagers, it was terrifyingly close to home. Brittanee was their age, doing what they might do, caught in a situation anyone could stumble into. The story stayed alive not only through broadcasts, but through community pressure. Flyers decorated storefront windows, taped to gas pumps and restaurant doors. At football games and church gatherings, her name was spoken aloud. For 3 years, the disappearance of Brittanee Drexel refused to fade from the collective memory of Myrtle Beach. By August, just months after her disappearance, a new tool emerged: digital billboards. Across the Grand Strand, from the tourist-packed strips of Myrtle Beach to the quieter coastal highways, electronic signs flashed Brittanee's face. Missing, Brittanee Drexel, glowed in bright, unmissable letters, alongside tip-line numbers urging the public to speak up. The strategy was simple: flood the public eye with her image so no one could forget her. Drivers on their daily commute, tourists heading to the beach, truckers cutting through town, all were forced to see her name. Some slowed down, staring at the flashing photograph of a girl who could have been their daughter, their sister, their friend. It was more than an information campaign. It was a plea. The billboards kept her case alive in the public's mind, reminding the community that this wasn't just another runaway or another headline destined to fade. But behind the coordinated searches and glowing billboards was a family living in torment. Dawn Drexel drove to Myrtle Beach countless times, sitting in police stations, attending vigils, and standing before cameras when her voice was nearly gone from repeating the same words: "Please help us find my daughter." Each vigil drew candles, flowers, and prayers, but no Brittanee. Each passing anniversary was marked by both determination and unbearable grief. The community too felt the weight. Residents began locking their doors earlier, watching their teenagers with more suspicion, warning them not to walk alone at night. Myrtle Beach was a tourist destination, a place where families escaped to relax. Yet suddenly, it carried the shadow of something darker. The disappearance of a 17-year-old girl cast a pall over the boardwalk lights and ocean breezes. Police received hundreds of tips. Some came from neighbors who swore they saw her near Georgetown. Others claimed she'd been spotted walking through backroads near McClellanville. Each call lit a spark of hope. Each lead sent detectives down another path. But again and again, the paths collapsed into nothing. The dogs would find a trace, then lose it. Witnesses would swear they recognized her, only for the trail to prove false. Frustration grew. Rumors spread. In communities where whispers travel faster than facts, stories multiplied. Some claimed she'd been kidnapped into human trafficking. Others said she was hiding. Still others believed she had drowned. The theories swirled louder with each year she remained missing. As months turned into years, the urgency of the first searches slowly shifted into the grinding rhythm of a cold case, though authorities never stopped investigating. Detectives pursued new technology, tested DNA samples, and interviewed known offenders in the area. Special task forces were formed, digging deeper into Brittanee's digital footprint, trying to piece together where she had gone after she left that hotel room in April 2009. But even as investigators pressed on, silence grew heavier. For her family, each holiday was a reminder. Each birthday passed with an empty chair. Dawn Drexel said it best in an interview. "I live every day with a hole in my heart. I just want to bring my daughter home." The deeper the months turned into years, the more the absence of Brittanee Drexel dug into the people who loved her most. By 2010, a strange new normal had set in. One where her family had no answers, only rituals of remembrance, and a community that continued to ask the same haunting question: where was Brittanee? Her family and community worked to make sure she was not forgotten. In local media, honorary diplomas were referenced, a symbol that even though Brittanee was not there, her classmates in town carried her memory into adulthood. For parents, that gesture cut deep. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was proof of a future stolen. These memorial efforts were more than symbolic. They were strategic. Every event, every mention in the newspaper, every gathering ensured that Brittanee's disappearance did not fade into obscurity. The family had learned quickly that in missing persons cases, time could be the enemy. If people stopped talking about Brittanee, if the story became yesterday's news, the likelihood of finding answers diminished. And so they fought back with remembrance, turning grief into persistence. By April 2012, 3 years had passed since Brittanee walked that stretch of Ocean Boulevard for the last time. Her family and supporters gathered at the Market Common, a bustling area of Myrtle Beach filled with shops, parks, and families. The very kind of place Brittanee herself might have visited had her life not been cut short. There, a tree was planted in her honor. It wasn't just any tree. It was chosen to symbolize both growth and permanence. Roots reaching into the soil of a city that had last seen her, branches stretching upward toward the sky, carrying her name with them. Family members stood with clasped hands, some crying, others silent, as the young sapling was lowered into the earth. Onlookers lit candles, whispered prayers, and spoke her name aloud. To plant a tree is to make a promise that her memory would not die, even if answers remained hidden. The memorial was a physical marker in Myrtle Beach, a place where people could come to grieve, to reflect, and to remind themselves that Brittanee still mattered. At that same time, investigators released age-progressed photos of what Brittanee might look like if she were alive in 2012. These computer-generated images tried to age her face, showing the public how a 20-year-old Brittanee might appear. The photos were unsettling for many who saw them. They carried the sharp innocence of her high school picture, but with subtle changes: a different hairstyle, a slightly matured face. For her family, those photos were both painful and necessary. Painful because they forced them to imagine what Brittanee could have grown into, had she been given the chance. Necessary because they kept the case alive and provided the public with a fresh image to look for, in case she was still out there. Even as the family built memorials and the community lit candles, law enforcement quietly continued their work. Behind the scenes, investigators were piecing together names, patterns, and known offenders who had once roamed the Myrtle Beach and Georgetown County corridors. Around 2011, one name began to surface in connection to the case: Raymond Moody. At the time, Moody was no stranger to law enforcement. He was a registered sex offender with a violent criminal history, including a prior conviction for abducting and sexually assaulting a young girl in California back in the 1980s. After serving more than 2 decades in prison, he had returned to South Carolina, living quietly, or so it seemed. Some sources began to publicly identify him as a possible person of interest in Brittanee's case. He lived in the Surfside Beach area, just a short distance from where Brittanee was last seen. He had the kind of past that made investigators uneasy. And, most chillingly, on the very weekend of Brittanee's disappearance, records later showed that Moody had been in the area. In fact, he had even been pulled over during a traffic stop in Surfside Beach shortly after she went missing. Despite this, no formal charges were filed at the time. There wasn't enough evidence to link him directly. For investigators, the suspicion was there, but the hard proof was not. For the public, the mention of his name was a tremor beneath the surface. People whispered about him. Some pointed fingers. But without charges, Raymond Moody remained only a shadow in the background of the investigation. Unsettling, menacing, but unconfirmed. These years were a brutal balance of hope and helplessness. On one hand, the memorials and media coverage kept Brittanee's story alive, making sure her face never left the public eye. On the other, the whispers of potential suspects and the lack of charges reminded everyone that justice was still far out of reach. By the summer of 2016, 7 long years had passed since Brittanee Drexel disappeared. 7 years of vigils, press conferences, and countless searches that ended in heartbreak. 7 years of waiting, hoping, and enduring the unrelenting silence of not knowing. Then, in June of that year, the silence broke. The FBI stepped forward, not with cautious optimism or vague reassurances, but with a chilling, definitive statement. They believed Brittanee had been abducted, held against her will, and murdered. It was more than just another press release. For the first time, federal investigators publicly declared what many had feared, but could not say aloud with certainty. Brittanee wasn't just missing. She wasn't lost, confused, or hiding. She was gone. Standing before reporters, FBI officials detailed their belief that Brittanee had been taken to a stash house in McClellanville, South Carolina, a small, rural community tucked deep within the Low Country's marshlands and pine forests. The phrase itself, stash house, carried an ominous weight. It conjured up images of abandoned shacks, hidden away from main roads, used by criminals to hold drugs, weapons, or in this horrific case, human beings. Investigators said they believed Brittanee was kept there against her will, held for days, and then ultimately murdered. This wasn't speculation whispered in the shadows. It was the FBI going on record, anchoring years of rumors and theories into an official declaration. For her family, it was devastating. A heavy blow delivered not in the form of evidence or discovery, but in the form of belief. At the same time, the FBI escalated its commitment. They announced a $25,000 reward for any information that could lead to an arrest and conviction. Rewards had been posted before, but this one struck differently. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a homicide investigation. That shift carried weight. The federal government was signaling to the public, we're not just looking for her, we're hunting the people responsible. The figure, $25,000, was enough to stir interest, to push those sitting on secrets to reconsider their silence. For some, it was incentive. For others, it was a threat. A reminder that loose lips could suddenly grow costly for anyone complicit in the crime. And then, almost predictably, the floodgates opened. Jailhouse informants, men serving their own sentences, living in the underworld of South Carolina's detention system, began coming forward with stories. They claimed to know what had happened to Brittanee, who was responsible, and even where her body had been taken. The accounts were dark, grotesque, and conflicting, but they carried enough detail to demand attention. Some of these informants told investigators that Brittanee had been held in McClellanville after being abducted from Myrtle Beach. She was allegedly sexually assaulted, degraded, and ultimately killed. Others added even more horrifying details, that her body had been disposed of in alligator pits, deep in the swamps and marshes of Georgetown County. The imagery was almost too gruesome to comprehend. A teenage girl, stripped of her future, her remains thrown into the maw of reptiles beneath the black water of the Low Country swamps. One name began to surface repeatedly in these accounts: Timothy Deshawn Taylor. Taylor, a young man from the McClellanville area, had a criminal record, though nothing as severe as what was being alleged now. According to multiple jailhouse informants, Taylor was implicated in Brittanee's disappearance and murder. Some claimed he had been involved in holding her captive. Others said he played a role in moving her or disposing of her remains. The problem was this: none of it was backed by hard physical evidence. It was whispers in the prison yard, men looking to cut deals or curry favor by attaching themselves to one of the most high-profile missing persons cases in South Carolina history. Yet, in the absence of a body, in the absence of DNA or direct proof, these whispers took on power. They gave investigators enough to push further, to search harder, to test every lead, no matter how slim. For the public, the name Timothy Deshaun Taylor became synonymous with the ongoing mystery. For the family, it was another wave of torment, hearing detailed accounts of their daughter's final days, yet still having nothing tangible to hold on to. In response to these tips, authorities launched a series of searches across Georgetown County and the surrounding low-country areas. Canine units, cadaver dogs, forensic teams, and dive crews scoured swamps, woods, and waterlogged pits. The term alligator pits became a morbid fixture in news reports. Shallow, marshy watering holes notorious in the area. Search teams combed through thick brush, waded into dark waters, and examined the murky depths where, if the informants were telling the truth, Brittanee's remains could have been discarded. The searches were exhaustive, physically draining, and emotionally crushing. Every time crews entered the woods, there was a flicker of hope, a chance that finally they would bring Brittanee home. Every time they emerged empty-handed, that hope curdled into despair. Despite the intensity of these operations, nothing definitive was found. No remains, no clothing, no trace of Brittanee. It was as if the swamp itself had swallowed the truth, keeping its secrets buried in mud and shadows. By the end of 2016, the Drexel case lived in two conflicting narratives. On one hand, the FBI's declaration provided something the family had long begged for: clarity. Their daughter had not simply vanished into thin air. She had been taken, held, and killed. It was an answer, however brutal. On the other hand, the details that emerged through jailhouse informants painted an image so horrifying that it was almost unbearable. A teenage girl, locked in a stash house, assaulted, discarded in a swamp. For Dawn Drexel, Brittanee's mother, the year was a cruel paradox. She had answers, but no closure. Leads, but no evidence. Suspects, but no convictions. The FBI's homicide declaration did more than shift the tone of the case. It reignited the media, drawing national attention once again to the disappearance of Brittanee Drexel. Television stations replayed her last known footage outside the Blue Water Resort. Newspapers revisited the timeline, from the spring break trip she never told her mother about, to the haunting phone pings that tracked her south toward Georgetown. And on social media, her name surged again, shared by people who had never met her but felt the sting of her story. Hashtags carried her memory across platforms, each post demanding justice, each share keeping her alive in the digital world. 2016 marked a brutal turning point. What had once been the desperate search for a missing girl was now, undeniably, a homicide investigation. The FBI had named the crime for what it was. They had described the nightmare in plain words. But the truth was still fractured. Informants talked, suspects were named, searches were launched. And yet, the central mystery remained unsolved. Brittanee was gone. But where was she? And who, exactly, had silenced her forever? The answers, investigators believed, were still hidden in the swamps, in the shadows of McClellanville, and in the conscience of those who knew more than they were willing to admit. In March of 2017, law enforcement zeroed in again on Georgetown County, the stretch of South Carolina marshland and woodland that had haunted this case since the first days of investigation. This time, their focus was a wooded area near Foxfire Court, a quiet, rural part of Georgetown. Teams arrived with equipment, dogs, and the silent determination of people who had chased too many dead ends. They combed through thick brush and undergrowth, digging, probing, searching for anything that might bring Brittanee home. To outsiders, the location might have seemed random. But for those following the case closely, Georgetown wasn't just another patch of land. It was part of the territory consistently tied to the rumors of stash houses, of men moving Brittanee after her abduction, of the grim possibility that she had been killed and disposed of in these very woods. Residents watched from their porches as law enforcement trucks rolled in. For them, the return of investigators was both hopeful and unsettling, a reminder that something terrible had passed through their community years earlier, something that still cast a shadow over their streets. Despite the scale of the search, no substantial discoveries were ever confirmed publicly. Officials remained tight-lipped, and when the teams pulled out, they left behind the same uncertainty that had plagued the case from the beginning. Brittanee's family endured another crushing cycle. Hope sparked, only to be snuffed out. 2 years later, in February 2019, the case took a dramatic and disturbing turn when a prison informant named Taquan Brown came forward with a recorded interview. His account was chilling. Brown claimed that after her disappearance in April 2009, Brittanee had been seen multiple times alive in the McClellanville area. According to him, she had been held in a so-called stash house, moving from place to place, her captivity stretching out in the shadows of South Carolina's low country. Brown said that while she was held, she had been repeatedly assaulted. He painted a picture of a teenager enduring unimaginable torment, stripped of her freedom and dignity, forced into a nightmare that lasted far longer than anyone had imagined. But the darkest detail came when he described what he claimed was her final fate. Brown alleged that at one point, an argument broke out among those holding her. He claimed Brittanee was ultimately shot, executed, and then her body wrapped and carried away. It was a horrifying story, one that aligned with some of the earlier jailhouse whispers investigators had chased in 2016. But like those whispers, it also suffered from the same fatal flaw. It wasn't supported by direct, physical evidence. Still, the weight of Brown's account couldn't be dismissed outright. His recorded interview added another layer of urgency, giving investigators new reason to re-examine leads and revisit old suspects. The weight of the details crushed the Drexel family. To hear that Brittanee might have spent her final days in captivity before being murdered was a cruelty beyond words. For Dawn Drexel, every claim from an informant reopened the anguish, making her picture her daughter's suffering in ways no parent should have to bear. Perhaps in response to this wave of claims, or perhaps as part of the FBI's ongoing strategy, April 2019 brought a renewed push for public awareness. The timing was deliberate. It had been exactly 10 years since Brittanee had disappeared. 10 years of vigils, 10 years of waiting, 10 years without answers. For investigators, the anniversary was both a painful marker and an opportunity, a chance to remind the public that the case was not forgotten, that there was still time for someone to step forward. The FBI increased the reward, raising the stakes for anyone who might be holding information. Billboards, media reports, and online campaigns resurfaced Brittanee's story, putting her name and face once again in the spotlight. The message was clear. 10 years may have passed, but this case was not going cold. Brittanee Drexel still mattered. Bittersweet defined the renewed campaign for Dawn Drexel. Every interview, every press conference tore the wound open again. She smiled for the cameras, spoke her daughter's name, begged the public for help. And when the lights dimmed, she returned home to the same void. Her daughter, still gone. From 2017 to 2019, The Drexel case existed in a strange tension between progress and stagnation. On one hand, there were searches, real, boots-on-the-ground efforts to scour land and water for her remains. There were informants, people inside prison walls, whispering accounts that investigators couldn't ignore. There were renewed campaigns, the FBI pumping resources and attention into the case, determined not to let it fade. On the other hand, there were no breakthroughs, no body, no definitive evidence, no arrests. Each year felt like circling the same storm, moving closer, but never quite reaching the center. For the public, the case was haunting. For her family, it was unbearable. The words cold case never meant that nothing was happening. They meant that nothing was breaking. Every move forward seemed to dissolve into mist, leaving behind only rumors and heartache. As 2019 closed, the Drexel case stood at a crossroads. The FBI had doubled down on its commitment. Informants had painted terrifying pictures of Brittanee's final days. Searches had scoured swamps and woods once again. And yet, the mystery endured. No grave awaited Dawn Drexel. No certainty offered her peace. Investigators, too, had no evidence to shift speculation into conviction. But change was coming. The years ahead would finally rip the case wide open, shattering the fog of rumor with hard truth. The question wasn't if, it was when. It began not with a search party or a tip called into a hotline, but with a man walking through the doors of law enforcement custody. On May 4th, 2022, Raymond Moody, a 62-year-old registered sex offender, either turned himself in voluntarily or was swiftly taken into custody on obstruction of justice charges. On the surface, that charge seemed ordinary, the kind of legal maneuver investigators sometimes use when they know more than they can publicly say. But for those close to the case, the detail that mattered was when investigators tied the obstruction to the very day Brittanee disappeared in April 2009. It was no coincidence. This wasn't a routine arrest. It was the crack in the case everyone had been waiting for. Almost immediately after being taken into custody, the facade of denial crumbled. Moody began to talk. For over a decade, he had remained a name in the background, a figure sometimes whispered about, sometimes dismissed, a man who had lived freely while Brittanee's family lived in torment. Now, with his back against the wall, he confessed. But what chilled investigators and the family wasn't just that he confessed. It was what came next. Moody agreed to lead law enforcement to a location. For 13 years, searchers had combed highways, ditches, waterways, and backwoods, following leads that led nowhere. Now, the man who had held the truth all along pointed the way himself. The directions led investigators deep into a wooded area in Georgetown County, South Carolina, far removed from the neon lights of Myrtle Beach, where Brittanee had last been seen. The soil here was heavy, the kind that doesn't easily give up its secrets. But on May 11, 2022, that ground finally surrendered the truth. Human remains were discovered. For investigators hardened by years of difficult cases, this moment was different. They knew what they were looking at was not just another crime scene. This was the final chapter in a young girl's story that had been frozen in time since 2009. For the Drexel family, the news carried a dual weight: the crushing finality that Brittanee was gone, and the somber relief that at least they had found her. After more than a decade of not knowing where their daughter was, they finally had a place, a body, and the truth. Within days, forensic experts worked urgently. Dental records and DNA confirmation were used to officially identify the remains. On May 15th or 16th, the heartbreaking confirmation was announced. The remains belonged to Brittanee Drexel. The details that followed were grim. Investigators confirmed that Brittanee had been strangled, and court documents later alleged that the murder occurred between April 25th and April 26th, 2009. The very night she walked alone down that Myrtle Beach street, believing she would return to her hotel. For the family, hearing the method of death was another wound, proof of the brutality Brittanee faced in her final moments. For the public, it was a reminder of the kind of predator who had walked among them undetected for years. With Brittanee's remains recovered and Moody's confession on record, the legal machinery moved quickly. Moody was formally charged with murder, kidnapping. First-napping charges were not symbolic. Each one carried the weight of years of investigation, years of rumors, years of silence. Each one acknowledged the suffering Brittanee endured, the loss her family carried, and the betrayal a community felt knowing her killer had lived freely among them all this time. By the time October 19, 2022 arrived, the Drexel family had lived 13 years waiting for accountability. They did not have to wait through a long, drawn-out trial. Raymond Moody did something many killers refuse to do. He pleaded guilty to all charges. The courtroom was quiet, heavy with the weight of years of grief. The plea was both a final admission and a final surrender. Moody would not contest what he had done. There would be no denial, no spectacle, no false hope. For Dawn Drexel, Brittanee's mother, hearing the word guilty may not have provided peace, because peace is a fragile word when your daughter's life was stolen. But it provided something close to justice. The judge delivered a sentence that ensured Raymond Moody would never again see freedom. Life in prison without parole for the murder of Brittanee Drexel. A consecutive terms totaling 60 years for kidnapping and sexual misconduct. Together, the sentence closed the door on Moody's life outside prison walls. There would be no appeals dragging the case out for years, no possibility of release. He would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, carrying the weight of what he had done. The sentencing did not erase 13 years of fear, anguish, and unanswered questions. But for the community, it was a turning point. For years, Myrtle Beach had been haunted by the specter of Brittanee's disappearance. Locals remembered the flyers, the vigils, the desperate pleas for information. Each tourist season, as new visitors crowded the beachfront, residents remembered the teenager from New York who vanished in 2009 and was never seen again. Now, there was closure. The case that had been a wound in the community for over a decade had finally been resolved. For the Drexel family, closure was bittersweet. They had an answer, yes, but no answer could return their daughter. No sentence could restore the years stolen from her. Brittanee's father, Chad, and her mother, Dawn, had fought relentlessly to keep her memory alive, to keep pressure on investigators, to keep the search for justice moving even when the trail grew cold. In the end, their fight was not in vain. When Raymond Moody was led away to spend the rest of his life in prison, he left behind a legacy of horror. But Brittanee left behind a legacy of resilience. A reminder that even when justice takes years, even when it feels out of reach, it can still come. The 2022 conviction of Raymond Moody closed one of the darkest chapters in South Carolina's recent history. Today, Raymond Moody sits in prison with no chance of release, and Brittanee Drexel's name lives on. Not as a cold case, not as a question mark, but as a young woman whose story, at long last, was told in full. To many, the October 2022 guilty plea and life sentence of Raymond Moody seemed like the final chapter in Brittanee Drexel's story. But the case did not close there. In the years that followed, investigators began peeling back the layers of deception surrounding Moody, and their work revealed that he had not been entirely alone in the shadows. In 2024, federal prosecutors indicted Angel Vaz, Moody's girlfriend at the time of Brittanee's disappearance, on charges of lying to FBI investigators. For years, Vaz had denied any knowledge of the events of April 2009. Yet evidence suggested she had concealed details and misled authorities during key stages of the investigation, obstruction that may have cost precious time. By early 2025, Vaz admitted her deception. She pleaded guilty in federal court, marking another step toward accountability in the tangled web of this case. But perhaps the most chilling development came from Moody himself. From behind bars, he began making new claims. That Vaz was more than a bystander. According to him, she had been part of the plan from the beginning, allegedly luring Brittanee, helping to restrain her, and assisting in the setup that led to her abduction. He insisted she was not directly involved in the rape or murder, but the suggestion that Brittanee's fate had been orchestrated by more than one person reignited public outrage. For Brittanee's family, these revelations reopened wounds they had only just begun to process. Justice had been served against Moody, but questions lingered. How much did Vaz know? And how different might the investigation have been if she had told the truth in 2009? The case, Sex 0.05 even after conviction, continues to echo with haunting reminders that Brittanee's story was never just about one man, but about the lies, silence, and complicity that let her killer act unchecked. Brittanee's story reminds us that silence and delay can cost lives, and that every missing person deserves to be found. If cases like this matter to you, don't just watch and move on. Subscribe to this channel so Brittanee, and others like her, are never forgotten. Like this video to keep her memory alive. Comment your city or country below, and I'll investigate and share a cold case from your community. Because these stories deserve to be told before it's too late.